And then you begin to wonder, and finally you say, why? Why do I owe that country anything? What they've done to my state, my country, what they're doing to it every day. They don't even give you time to forgive and forget. They come along with another regulation. But you get to thinking, well, why the hell do I owe them anything? And then you get mad. And you say the hell with them. And you renounce allegiance. And you pledge your efforts, your effects, your honor, your life to Alaska. That's how I do. I'm an Alaskan, see. And they know it. I've told them so, to go to hell in every way I can, in a nice way. I took a case to the Supreme Court, believing in the Supreme Court, that I'd rather be tried in a whorehouse with a madam as a judge. There's more justice. And if they don't like it, they know where they can go. I tried it. I believed in my country. I believed in the court system, and it stinks. They don't pay you for property rights they take away from you. We have patented ground that we haven't been able to use for 8 years. We put $300,000 in over there, and it's locked up, locked up for 8 years. My wife and I had a good time there. We didn't take 300, 400, 500 ounces out, a couple of kids. We had a good time there. They taken 8 years of our lives. She'll never be able to go back to the creek with me. And if you think I'm ever going to forget that, the fires of hell are frozen glaciers compared to my hatred for the American government. And I won't be buried under their damn flag. I'll be buried in Dawson. And when Alaska is an independent nation, they can bring my bones home, back to my country.
In 2008, John McCain chose Sarah Palin as his running mate. Picking her for vice president was a black spot in his entire campaign. By choosing her, the media didn't even need to attack him because Palin was an easy target that had few political friends, unlike McCain. There was plenty to criticize about John McCain, trust me, but the media had their orders. Take out Palin and in turn take out the entire McCain-Palin campaign. As if the colorfully named porn Who's Nailin' Palin or endless SNL skits weren't enough, the left and right both used her previous association with the AIP, or Alaskan Independence Party, to destroy her on the basis of being a radical secessionist. Many quoted the party's late founder, a man named Joe Vogler. Not a single one of those mainstream talking heads bothered to talk about Joe with anything other than hate and uneducated taunts. Most made comparisons to neo-Confederates and other groups not aligned with the AIP in reality, but it didn't matter as long as it was close enough and sounded good on TV.
So the McCain camp is playing the association game for all it is worth, whatever it's worth. But inspecting the other guy's pals is a double-edged moose hunting sword. If your vice presidential nominee has spent years palling around with fringe Alaskans who are pushing to secede from the United States. According to a brand new story on Salon.com, Sarah Palin's ties to the fringe Alaska Independence Party are deeper than previously reported. Want to know what the party's founder, Joe Vogler, was all about? Try these quotes. Quote, "I'm an Alaskan, not an American. I've got no use for America or her damned institutions." That's one from the party's website. From a 1991 interview, quote, "The fires of hell are frozen glaciers compared to my hatred for the American government. Wow. And I won't be buried under their damn flag." Now, in the same way Barack Obama was not a member of the Weather Underground, Sarah Palin was never a member of the Alaska Independence Party. However, non-member Palin has attended party conventions, has addressed the convention as recently as this year in 2008, saying, quote, "Keep up the good work." Does that constitute palling around? Is there more to this story? Joining us now is Max Blumenthal, a fellow at the Nation Institute. He has just reported and written a brand new story about Palin's connections to the Alaska Independence Party for Salon.com. Max, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, great to be here.
For people unfamiliar with Alaska politics, what's the Alaska Independence Party all about? Is there anything in the politics of the lower 48 to compare them to?
There is. In the lower 48, there's a neo-Confederate secessionist movement that reveres the Confederacy, the lost cause, and they are intimately linked with the Alaskan Independence Party. So is the Constitution Party, a theocratic party that wants to put the United States under the control of biblical law. The Alaskan Independence Party, since it was founded by Joe Vogler, has been a haven for anti-government extremists, anti-government militia members, and conspiratorial figures who believe that the United States government plans to implement a new world order.
We're seeking a plebiscite in which there'll be three choices, with Alaskans voting on it.
So this was originally the intent of the Alaska.
That's right. That's what we have. That is our prime motive. Just we want to vote. We'll live by the results of it. But that vote is a sacred right that we will have to the end of time. That is under the human right of political self-determination, see. That's all we ask for. Let the people, maybe they'll vote to be made a state.
So you're not advocating a position?
No. We're not secessionists. We're separatists. And the United States set up the machinery. But why don't they practice what they preach?
I was a kid when I saw this, and shortly thereafter I'd be introduced to the ideas of Ron Paul, a man running at the same time as McCain. His ideas involved something McCain did not: principles. Unlike McCain, Ron Paul was standing for something that mattered: liberty. And to do that, those principles would need to play a big role. I would never really hear about Joe Vogler again until about 2 years ago when I read about his actual beliefs. I learned much like Ron Paul, Joe Vogler had those ever-important principles. So I decided to make this and tell the story of Joe Vogler, what he did in his life and how it ended too soon. I hope you enjoy. Joe Vogler was born on April 24th, 1913, just outside of Barnes, Kansas. He was one of 5 children who grew up working hard, living on a farm with his family around Waterville. It was this hard work that would prepare him for his future of determination and the fiery politics he'd bring to the table.
Hello, Joe Vogler, and welcome to Alaska Gold Trails. It's a pleasure to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be here, Jim.
Tell us, Joe, let's just get this started right. Where did you come from, and in what year did you arrive on the planet?
Oh, that was about April 24th, 1913. I don't know where I come from. I'm not sure where I'm going, but that's the statistics that show up on my birth certificate.
And tell us, Joe, is there a lot of mining around that part of Kansas? Is that where you got interested in mining?
I think that probably came from my grandfather, because when I was about 9 years old, I moved to the country, and I'd started in a little country school. Had one room, and I think about 15 kids, and a pot-bellied stove in the middle for heat, one teacher, and you heard everybody recite. So you got an education from the 1st grade through the 8th, no matter whether you wanted it or not. And a teacher asked us what we wanted out of life, and I told her I wanted 10 acres of ground, paid for. I wanted a rock house that couldn't burn. I wanted an orchard and a garden, and then I wanted enough gold buried to pay taxes as long as I lived. This was in 1921 or 2, and the panic at 21 had pretty well cleaned out the farming area in Kansas. Every other farm was either owned by a bank or an insurance company, and times were tough. The poor farms were filled with people, the county poor farm, and so something had impressed upon my mind that it was necessary to pay taxes, and I figured that was the best hedge. And I probably can blame my grandfather for it, because he used to sell cattle, and the rumor was that he brought it home in gold coins and buried it.
At just the age of 16, he would win a scholarship and attend the University of Kansas. He'd graduate with a law degree and pass the Kansas State Bar at just the age of 21.
And I spent 4 years in Waterville, Kansas. That's a little town in Marshall County. I lived in the farm and went there for high school and got out of high school in May of 1929. 16 years old, and things weren't too good.
Mm-hmm. And
the farming area was still in the Depression, although the October crash hadn't hit yet, but it was not good, I'll tell you that much.
You went on to college, right?
Yeah, I took a scholarship examination in the spring of 29, Summerfield Scholarship at Salina, Kansas, and I was one of the 10 selected, and I got 4 years of college out of that, $500 a year, and that put me through school. And I borrowed $600, I think, for my final year, and graduated in 1934 with a law degree, and was admitted to the bar the following, next month or so, I think June of 34. Yeah, I see, I'd planned on having to work my way through school, and I'd dreamed about going to the Rolla School of Mines. But that didn't work out. My father wanted to be a lawyer, and when I wound up with a scholarship, why, that's all I heard. You didn't argue much with Papa at that time.
From what I've heard, you don't argue much with Joe Vogler at this time.
He would never practice law, though, instead finding work in Texas until 1942, when he would be fired due to his statements regarding FDR. He is quoted as calling him a commie bastard. Facing this in the general political landscape of World War II America, he would decide to make the journey to Alaska to find a new style of living in politics. He spent some time in Kodiak and found a job working for the Army Corps of Engineers in Fairbanks until 1951. By this time, Joe Vogler would begin his true Alaskan calling, beginning to open a mining operation on Homestead Creek off the Steese Highway north of Fairbanks.
Joe Vogler, tell us about what happened when you came up to Kodiak. What did you do there?
Oh, I come up. I had a job in the office, and I didn't like that, so it wasn't too long before I went to work in the grease rack.
And what was the company, Joe?
Oh, the Sims, Drake, Puget Sound Bridge and Dredging Company, I think. It was a consortium of companies that were building the naval facilities in Old Woman's Bay outside of Kodiak. And they were putting in submarine pens and airplane hangars and revetments and improving the runway. It was a defense project.
How long did you work for them?
Oh, I worked, let's see, that March 28th, the CBs came in the following spring. We worked at Danger Bay out there, putting in an installation there for the Army Engineers. I fished a stretch in June and July of 43. And when the traps were fishing so well, why we had to throw our fish overboard in the back bay, we decided that was a bad deal. Then I come across to Anchorage and hired out to Morrison Knudsen. Came to Fairbanks in September, and we tore a drag line down at North Camp, put it up on pipe dollies, and hauled it the North Way, put it together, and they lengthened the runway down there. And mechanic, grease, did anything. You did anything and everything. We cut logs to lengthen the runway. The little planes were running off the end of the runways that were being delivered to the Soviet Union, see, through here. They come through here just like a bunch of mosquitoes every day.
And so you had to be a jack of all trades.
Do whatever was called on. You didn't ask any questions. If it had to be done, why, you did it. Mm-hmm. People didn't worry about crossing over Union lines or duties or anything else. It was, that's the nice part about Alaska. If you can't do this, well, you can do something else.
Joe's first battle in Alaska was soon around this time against Paul and Flora Greiman. They operated a company called the University Bus Lines that primarily moved students to the University Alaska Fairbanks. The buses at the time that the private company used could not travel across the Cushman Street Bridge in Fairbanks without stopping traffic because it was simply not wide enough for a large vehicle and even small car to travel on at the same time. Joe and his lawyer sued, and the Fairbanks Daily News took notice, branding it as the Battle of the Bridge. Joe and his lawyer sought a permanent injunction against the company for straddling the center of the bridge. Many people came to remember Joe Vogler's name at this time because they too grew tired of the endless bridge game being played by the bus line. Even though the lawsuit ended in a loss, it did push Fairbanks to replace the bridge in 1959. Between this and his opinion letters that would be published in Fairbanks and Anchorage papers, Joe's story would become one of going up against the federal government, oil companies, and environmentalists, all while fighting for all Alaskans. Joe continued mining and developing property, and by the 70s he had over 300 acres. He would gain success at a time in Alaska when the federal government didn't care for miners or land developers for that matter. Miners by the 70s in Alaska were seen by the federal government as a nuisance. The same feeling was held by many oil corporations and by environmentalists now finding a new bureaucratic home in the last frontier. Land developers that did not cozy up with the state and federal government got not so great treatment when getting permits or permissions. Joe grew angry at the way Alaska was treated by the federal government, in part because during the building of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, the federal government retained the ability to dictate how Alaska was allowed to collect its own oil and where it could collect it from.
We were to retain permanent sovereignty over our natural resources in another resolution. They were to be developed here for our economic advancement. And instead of that, in December of 1983 at this Alaska 2000 seminar, they bragged in New York City. The production of Alaska's raw materials will create a great many jobs in other states. where they be taken for manufacture and distribution. Now that's how America is treating Alaska. We're a place for their playground and a warehouse. And I don't like it.
This kind of treatment of Alaska and its people was not new. It was an issue foreseen by many at the time of Alaska's statehood. Actually, let's take a look at some details around that statehood. Alaska was made a state in 1959. It had been in the works going back to 1916. In 59, some people did oppose it, but a good deal of their arguments get buried under Cold War and Southern Democrat drama. With statehood pushed along by the 1954 and 55 Alaska Constitutional Convention, headed by future shadow Senators Ernest Gruning and Bill Egan, with support from Ted Stevens lobbying. Statehood seemed closer than ever in Alaska, and many did support it because they felt it would bring more business to the state and help regulate fishing traps being used. But what is often left out is how the decision to become a state came to be in the first place. Although it was true the process had began long before, ultimately to become a state, Alaskans needed to vote on three things first. Shall Alaska immediately be admitted into the Union as a state? The boundaries of the state of Alaska shall be as prescribed in the Act of Congress approved July 7, 1958. And all claims of this state to any areas of lands or sea outside the boundaries so prescribed are hereby irrevocably relinquished to the United States. And the third, all provisions of the Act of Congress approved July 7, 1958, reserving rights or powers to the United States, or as well those prescribing the terms or conditions of the grants of lands or other property therein made to the state of Alaska, are consented to fully by said state and its people. The vote would happen August 26, 1958, and would result in all three passing. Although that is not the entire story. When the vote was held, over 20% of the state's population was made up of U.S. military personnel. Another good portion was those personnel's family. This meant that the vote was almost certain to fall on the side of statehood in the first place, or put simply, the federal government and military-industrial complex of the Cold War era stuffed the ballot boxes. Some people have quoted the number of federal workers and personnel to be over 100,000 at the time of the vote in 1958. From the 1950s to the 1960s, post-World War II Alaska would go from around 44% native to less than 15%. Today, the largest landowner in Alaska is the federal government at around 65%. The state government owns around 31%, and around 4% is privately owned. Much of this is due to the fact that Alaska was only given 28% of its own land back from the federal government when it was admitted as the 49th state. Alaska was seen as an asset behind closed doors by the military and intelligence due to the Cold War and the military advantage Alaska could bring, being only around 55 miles away from Russia at its closest point. This had already been realized even before World War II, when in 1935, Brigadier General William Mitchell urged Congress to utilize strong northern air defenses. He stated to Congress, "I believe in the future, he who holds Alaska will hold the world." The federal government listened. Alaska was also a warehouse full of gold, silver, and copper, while already having oil found dating back to 1907. It had fishing, the opportunity for manufacturing, and a giant landmass to test the military-industrial complex's shiny new nuclear toys. When the dust of statehood settled, Alaska was forever changed, and as fast as prospectors poured into the state to find their fortunes, the military and federal government began to take ultimate advantage of their new icy playland. This would be stopped from happening at first by Alaskans until 1965 and 69, when nukes would be tested on Amchitka Island. In 1971, through Operation Grommet, the W-71 thermonuclear warhead, around 400 times the size of the bomb dropped in Hiroshima, would be detonated underground at the same island site, making it the largest bomb ever detonated underground at 5 megatons. Alaska has a population of 730,000, but is tied with Washington, D.C. for the highest percentage of government employees at 25%. The reality is that regardless of all of this today, a good majority of Alaska's problems have been created or made worse by the federal government. This is not a new opinion. It was one that was held by many Alaskans of Joe Vogler's era, and is still held today by many Alaskans who have grown to realize the federal government does not have the best intentions. Many of those problems caused by the federal government were predicted or called out in real time by Joe Vogler. In the early 70s, Joe Vogler put out a petition calling for Alaska's secession from the United States and gathered over 15,000 signatures. He is quoted as responding with the following: "The response has been beyond my wildest expectations. I never dreamed the people would respond like this." At the time, the population was under 150,000, so Joe was expecting a response from the Congress. This and other actions from the government would drive Joe and a group of other miners to create and organize the Alaska Independence Party in 1973. The party demanded a vote on independence from the United States due to them treating Alaska like a colony. In 1974, under the banner of the AIP, Joe Vogler would run for governor. He wouldn't win, but he was able to receive enough votes to swing the election in favor of the Republican candidate Jay Hammond by just under a 300-vote margin. Joe Vogler would go on to run for governor 2 more times in the future, but never win the position. These political runs would cement Joe Vogler as a colorful Alaskan with unique opinions and a sense of humor in the face of government power. On March 5, 1980, Joe Vogler and the AIP would begin to petition the United Nations, but the UN process was slow going and began to feel more like a waiting game. While they waited, Joe Vogler turned his sights towards another huge issue, taking rights from Alaskans: the national parks. Joe Vogler was a miner, and in Alaska, being a miner requires heavy equipment that allow Alaskans to harness the land to make their fortune and build communities. But the federal government required an access permit to move this equipment across national park lands that are federally owned. This is too much, and Joe Vogler was tired of the endless number of permits. In July, he was through with it and began driving his D8 cat on the Billenberg Trail to access his mine. This would lead to armed officers stopping Joe Vogler and his cat while making his way to his mine on the trail. It also would lead to yet another legal battle that Joe Vogler would take to the Alaska Supreme Court and eventually lose, although gaining support from many longtime Alaskans.
Wait a minute. That's what King George tried a little over 200 years ago, and it caused some problems back in the 13 colonies, and you know what happened to England. Well, I predict the same thing's going to happen here because you're going to have to get a permit to do everything. Well, maybe they can jam it down this younger generation's throat, get them in the habit of getting a permit, but I'll tell you what, I'm too old to start that. I was not born to be a permittee. You can be going down to rob a bank, and you've got a right to use that road. Why should anybody have a permit to travel? Who do they think they are? Is this what's coming in America? It's already been predicted you'll have to have a permit to travel from state to state. Are they going to do that in Alaska first? How much guts have they got? You know, I am really questioning where America's intended goal is, because everything I see is contrary to what it was. So I'm not going to be able to show you very much except a country that we should have the right to go about in. It's been that way since we've come up here. We've been able to move about freely and stake claims and cut timber and camp and fish and hunt. And if a park service is maintaining a park for the benefit of the public, they shouldn't be worrying about a few tracks out across the muskeg. They're the evidence of man's time here, of his activities here.
You know, if Mr. Vogler came in here this morning and he asked me for a permit, he could be driving that cat to his mine this afternoon.
They can go straight to hell, and hell will be frozen over solid before I'll do that. There's no compromise. The moment you start compromising, well, they're just going to keep backing you up. They get their foot in the door, it's like an elephant, and pretty soon the elephant's in and you're out. No way. When they were taking the last man away, back over to Woodchopper, one of the parkmen said, "You want me to pick up that stuff we left along the trail?" And he said, "Yes." All of it, yes. Well, I think that's where the body bags were, because I don't think they planned on us coming out of there. They was going to shut me up good, and to shut me up, they'd have killed a kid that was just turned 18, Kevin Wheeler, and John Ritter and John Howe, 2 kids 23 years of age. That's the only reason they could have had being out there with all that firepower. When something like that happens, and then you begin to wonder, and finally you say, why? Why do I owe that country anything? What they've done to my state, my country. what they're doing to it every day. They don't even give you time to forgive and forget. They come along with another regulation. But you get to thinking, well, why the hell do I owe them anything? And then you get mad. And you say the hell with them. And you renounce allegiance. And you pledge your efforts, your effects, your honor, your life to Alaska. That's how I do. I'm an Alaskan, see. And they know it. I've told them so, to go to hell in every way I can, in a nice way. I took a case to the Supreme Court, believing in the Supreme Court, that I'd rather be tried in a whorehouse with a madam as a judge. There's more justice. And if they don't like it, they know where they can go. I tried it. I believed in my country. I believed in the court system, and it stinks. They don't pay you for property rights they take away from you. We have patented ground that we haven't been able to use for 8 years. When you get a patent from the U.S. government, it says, and appurtenances. You're supposed to have access to it. We can have access during the winter months, customary winter months, when it's frozen and there's 12 inches of snow cover. That isn't access. You can't placer mine in the summertime. We put $300,000 in over there, and it's locked up, locked up for 8 years. My wife and I had a good time there. We didn't take 300, 400, 500 ounces out, a couple of kids. We had a good time there. They taken 8 years of our lives. She'll never be able to go back to the creek with me. And if you think I'm ever going to forget that, the fires of hell are frozen glaciers compared to my hatred for the American government. And I won't be buried under their damn flag. I'll be buried in Dawson. And when Alaska is an independent nation, they can bring my bones home, back to my country.
The AIP soon got good news in the form of some real political success, when in 1990 Joe Vogler talked John Lindauer into dropping out as the candidate for governor under the AIP banner for Walter Hickel instead. This was most likely a decision by Joe Vogler to get more national attention on the AIP, as Hickel was not openly in support of secession, but would still challenge the federal government on many issues the AIP cared about. This tactic worked, and Walter Hickel won, becoming governor of Alaska. This helped to pump life back into the AIP, with Joe Vogler at its helm as the chairman of the party currently holding the governor's seat. By 1992, Joe Vogler grew angry at the fact that Governor Hickel was not pushing for a vote on independence. He and some supporters took out full-page ads in Anchorage and Fairbanks newspapers, comparing Alaska with Lithuania and the United States to the Soviet Union. Joe Vogler would then decide to push again to speak at the United Nations General Assembly on the topic of Alaskan independence, but he needed a sponsor, and eventually found one with Iran and Ali Khamenei, who also disliked the United States government and may have seen allowing Joe Vogler to speak as a middle finger to them. This would mean that Joe Vogler would be on his way to make the case for Alaskan independence on the world stage, something that certainly would have impacted the situation. In 1993, he let some AIP members know that he would be leaving to New York in just a few weeks to speak to the UN. Joe Vogler sadly wouldn't make the trip, when on May 30th, 1993, Joe would go missing.
The Alaskan Independence Party was established by Joe and Doris Vogler and officially recognized as a political party by the state of Alaska rules 25 years ago. Within 10 years of that recognition, the party nominated the governor and the lieutenant governor, and they were elected. Before their term was over, Mrs. Vogler had passed away, and Mr. Vogler was assassinated.
Joe Vogler's neighbor would notice inactivity at his cabin for a few days. Joe had 5 dogs and a guard goose, but on May 30th, none of them were in sight, and his vehicle was in the driveway. Joe was reported missing to police, and almost immediately Fairbanks and all of Alaska began buzzing with rumors. The police found no sign of a struggle, no damage to the cabin, not a drop of blood. Joe's 5 dogs turned out to be locked inside his home, his guard goose was locked in its cage, and Joe, his small caliber handgun, and famous fedora were all missing. The police believe, due to there not being evidence of a crime, Joe Vogler, a man who had been in Alaska for more than 50 years, had simply wandered into the woods. They seem to hold the idea that Joe Vogler was a rambling 80-year-old, rather than the sharp, fiery individual he was in reality. This angered AIP members who, over the search for Joe, began to believe something bigger was at play. The police waited a good deal of time to search and secure Vogler's home, as they suspected no foul play initially. The AIP, in turn, decided to hire a former Alaskan police officer turned private investigator to find any details police may have missed. There was calls for the FBI to get involved in the search and investigation, but they declined. This is sadly how things would sit for quite some time. As months stretched on, people began to assume they no longer would be looking for Joe Vogler alive, and instead were looking for a body. Yellow flyers and buttons could be seen all over Fairbanks reading, "Where's Joe?" Slowly approaching a year since Joe's disappearance, and there'd still been no new details or information. Then a report came into police about a man that claimed someone had borrowed his truck and returned it after taking a trip to Fairbanks with a new paint job and a bullet hole in the hood. Police eventually came to the conclusion that the driver was a man named Manfred West. West had previously been arrested for check forgery and a past burglary and was known in Fairbanks well to police. The issue was, police could not simply question West, as he wasn't in jail for his previous crimes. He had been in custody, but was released to a halfway house who kicked him out soon after being placed there. Leaving the halfway house, he would take that opportunity to escape to a cabin his stepbrother owned. Police learned West was at the cabin and decided to arrest him for evasion of his previous crimes. Using an RV and around 6 officers hidden inside the vehicle and around the property, they began monitoring West and surrounding the cabin. Trooper Lance DeHick is quoted as saying, "We had an old motorhome, and we pretended it broke down in front of the cabin. The driver got out and hitchhiked away, and I laid in the motorhome and watched the cabin. That's how we found him." Manfred West was not going quietly, and was seen in the cabin with a rifle by the officers. The police began contact with West, and for over 3 hours, Trooper Sergeant James McCann attempted to talk West into coming outside. According to Trooper McCann, during this call, West would admit to killing Joe Vogler. West claimed he was attempting to sell Vogler C4 explosives. Vogler refused to turn over either gold or cash and told him to leave his property. Vogler shot at him but did not hit him. West responded by firing at Vogler. The first shot missed and the second hit. Though the small caliber bullet didn't bring him down, Vogler turned and ran, and West fired again, killing him. Soon after telling the trooper this, West would hang up after stating, "It's all over, bud. This place is gonna blow. The best you could do is get the hell out of here. The dynamite is in the living room." The cabin would be engulfed in flames soon after the call ended, and due to the risk of injury, the firefighters would wait until the cabin was smoldering to make a recovery. Expecting to recover remains, they would find a freezing Manfred West, partially submerged in water sprayed by the firefighters instead. He had fallen through the floor to a crawl space in a pool of icy water. With him in custody, he was placed under arrest and charged with arson and unlawful evasion. The police then turned to locating the body of Joe Vogler to charge West with murder. This was made more difficult because after West's arrest, he would attempt to get rid of his confession through the courts. The courts would then disagree and the confession stuck. Things changed when while West was in jail. Police received a tip from a cellmate of Manfred West who claimed he had told him the location of Joe Vogler's body. Using cadaver dogs, sure enough, the police would discover the body of Joe Vogler neatly wrapped in a blue tarp and duct tape, buried east of Fairbanks in a shallow grave over 16 months after his disappearance. Manfred West had a history with Joe. He even worked for a short time with the AIP. With West in custody and having confessed, police saw this as an open and shut. They came to the conclusion that it was a robbery gone wrong that ended with West killing Vogler. What was needed next was a murder trial. Certainly that would lay all the evidence out on the table for everyone to see. This would mean closure for Joe's family and the many people who saw him as an Alaskan hero. Here's a politician who during the Cold War and beyond had been calling for Alaska's independence while fighting with corporate interests and environmentalists. Manfred West was a low-life thief criminal who supposedly killed Vogler but took nothing of value from his home. West had re-entered the state under a fake name not long before Joe's disappearance. The AIP investigation also found that Joe's dogs had been drugged, something police claimed meant he was preparing them for the vet, while AIP members and friends of Joe claimed was ridiculous. They said Joe would never have drugged his dogs. This meant that it had to have been the killer. Furthermore, Joe had planned to speak at the UN in just weeks and had finally made headway in getting an AIP candidate into the governor's position. This made many believe Manfred West was a patsy and Joe Vogler was killed as part of a greater conspiracy. A trial would help to answer questions Alaskans had, and everyone waited awkwardly to see the results. But the results they got struck everyone off guard. On April 28, 1995, Manfred West would appear in court sporting a bulletproof vest. He would plead no contest for reduced charges. He received 80 years in prison and is there to this day. This meant no trial, no evidence, and no closure. The death of Joe Vogler was solved to police, but to AIP members and liberty-loving Alaskans everywhere, it left a bad taste in their mouth, the taste of a cover-up. From then on, the AIP would never really feel the same. In 2023, many people I talked to in making this had the same sentiment. Alaskan independence, in a way, died with Joe. I think this is true as long as Alaskans continue to bow down to the federal government. Maybe one day another man will lead a movement, much like Joe did. Hopefully this time we can make sure he isn't assassinated. In concluding this, I want to talk about my opinions regarding Joe's murder and some other thoughts. My primary issues with both the story put forward by police and West is as follows. Both versions have West shooting Vogler on the property just out Joe's cabin. The police put forward that this was a robbery turned murder. West put forward that this was an explosive sale turned self-defense after Joe attempted to remove him from his property and shot at him. Both police and West claim that Joe's body was then put in the back of a truck West was using and drove to the place the body was buried. Although West's version has him staying at the property to wait for police he assumed would be coming after all of the shooting. I have issues with this as the police found no evidence of blood at the scene, no drag marks, no sign of a scuffle, and no sign of a break-in. Joe Vogler was not a small man, and West is supposed to have loaded his body into his truck, leaving no evidence or blood behind. I find this to be frankly impossible. Joe had already been shot at this point, and West was not a sophisticated criminal. The idea that in either version of events, Joe was shot and removed from his property in what would have to be a perfect extraction is to me outside of reality. This was actually a point made by past Lieutenant Governor Jack Coghill in an interview for a City Confidential documentary that was done on Joe Vogler's death.
Personal opinion is that I think that Manfred was not smart enough to do what he did and be able to elude all of the science of detective research. That was probably one of the cleanest extractions of a person from his home. There was no, I mean, even the police dogs couldn't detect. They could go out so far, and was. How did Manfred do that? I don't know. I'm not a detective, but I think that there was another person, or there's some more accomplice to it.
I'm just an average street person that was a dumpster diver and lived off the land. I mean, what's the government going to come up to me and offer me money to go execute somebody? I mean, that would really show that the government's really lacking, I would think.
There's the issue of the dogs who all got found inside the home, something that does not make sense, especially when you take into account the possibility that they have been drugged. The police in this case seemed completely stumped until Wes entered the picture. Police had no explanation for Joe's disappearance. They had slumped back lazily into the idea that Joe just wandered off or left Alaska altogether. The political climate during the time of his disappearance was favoring Joe in the AIP. The disappearance was shortly after the end of the Cold War, when the federal government began reutilizing intelligence organizations and making plans for even more federal expansion in Alaska. Iran was also seen as an enemy by the government, and it would have been a smack in the face for them to allow Joe to speak at the UN. Joe had enemies outside of the government in the way of oil corporations and environmentalists, but none that reached the same level of the enemy one would make attempting to take power from the federal government. All of this leads to what I think happened. I think early on, Joe and the AIP was seen as mostly a joke by the federal government until 1980 when he would petition the UN. The government knew that the process would take time, and besides, no one would sponsor him to speak. This would change because of Ali Khamenei taking power in 1989 and him being willing to sponsor Joe Vogler privately. When this progressed behind closed doors, the government had an opportunity to remove the issue of Joe Vogler before his freedom-loving antics with the UN became public and a speech was given in front of them. The murder of the chair of the AIP would also help to knock the party off its track and make the duopoly of Democrats and Republicans cemented in Alaska forever. I feel that Joe was killed in part by Manfred West, but I believe it is impossible to have been done by only him. Manfred West was a fall guy, having flown to the state before Joe's murder under a different name. West still to this day has never been honest about what happened, even while knowing he will be in prison until he dies. The truth is, West was already supposed to be in custody and was only out of custody to take refuge in his stepbrother's cabin because the government kicked him out of a halfway house. Rather than just wait for West to leave the cabin to take him into custody, police would surround the cabin, leading to West almost burning to death. It was a complete surprise to police when they would find him alive because they had allowed the cabin to burn to rubble. Someone like myself has to ask if the police wanted West to survive after he hung up the phone and they decided to allow the cabin to burn completely. West never actually told the police the location of the body. Instead, this came from an anonymous tip, allegedly from one of Manfred West's cellmates. The tip involving the truck also came from an anonymous source. West had worked with Joe and knew about the AIP. He would have made a good tool for the government to gather information about the political happenings around Alaskan independence, no different than any other informant or asset today. Just like any other informant or asset, he was disposable. After the cabin burned, he attempted to get his confession removed from the trial, but failed and realized he was done for good. He would plead no contest to get a deal involving better prison placement, and the government would make sure no trial would be held to out the cover-up. Just like that, Joe Vogler's assassination was complete, patsy and all. Today, around half of the Alaskans I talked to about Joe Vogler believe that he was killed in part by the government, and I suppose I can now include myself with them after all the research I've done on the topic. What really is mind-blowing to me about this period of time in Alaska, and I'm talking around 1975 to Joe's death, is Alaska had a strong number of vocal, prominent figures talking about independence and fighting against the federal government. Regardless of the AIP, by the time Joe Vogler was assassinated, people in the population were making a great deal of noise regarding the federal government and independence. After Joe's assassination, all of that just kind of disappeared. The AIP, although in existence, never has been the same, and today, from a national perspective, might as well have disbanded after Joe died. I'm sad to say that if I'm right, Joe Vogler was assassinated by the federal government, and their mission was a success. Not only did Joe die, but what he was fighting for seems to have died with him.
The change that has come over Alaska, I think, has been a deliberate development. I think that America has regarded Alaska as sort of a warehouse wherein things were to be preserved, to be kept back, to be held back for development at a future date.
I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please consider subscribing. Maybe leave me a comment down below and let me know what you thought, did like, didn't like, whatever. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.